Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Winter Fuels Outlook webinar. My name is Matt French, and I'm the team lead for the Short-Term Integrated Products team at EIA in the Office of Energy Analysis. As most of you know, EIA is the statistical agency within the U.S. Department of Energy, and EIA's mission is to provide independent and impartial data and analysis that can be used by industry, policymakers, researchers, and others to better understand how energy markets function and in turn make more informed decisions. Before I go over today's agenda, I want to review a few housekeeping items. This Teams call is being recorded and may be posted on EIA's website or used internally. All attendees are muted and will not be able to share video during this webinar. However, if you have any concerns, please drop off the webinar at this time. There will be a question and answer period following the presentation, and you can submit your questions at any time using the question and answer or the Q&A function in the Teams control panel. The webinar will be posted on EIA.gov after the event. In terms of our agenda, EIA Administrator Joe DeCarolis will present the key findings for our Winter Fuels Outlook, and then we'll conduct a question and answer session with several EIA experts who put together our Winter Fuels Outlook and our Short-Term Energy Outlook. At this time, I'd like to turn over the presentation to Joe, who will address the price, consumption, and expenditure trends for major heating fuels for the upcoming winter.
All right, great. Thanks, Matt. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to present this year's Winter Fuels Outlook. But before I dive in, I just wanted to thank our staff for all their effort this year to deliver the report and the webinar. There's a tremendous amount of effort that goes into this work, and I'm honored to be able to present the results on their behalf. I also just wanted to take a second to recognize the importance of the Winter Fuels Outlook as an EIA product. The Outlook really speaks to important pocketbook issues for families across the country. Next slide. Okay, so what is the Winter Fuels Outlook? Well, it's EIA's forecast for upcoming winter residential energy expenditures, but we also help to contextualize those expenditures by looking at overall energy market conditions that could affect consumer spending on heating fuels in the coming months. Our forecasted expenditures represent the total cost associated with the primary fuel used to heat a home. And one new thing we have in this edition of the Outlook is, for the first time, we're splitting those total expenditures into the portion associated with space heating and then all other end uses. Next slide. So our Outlook covers 4 fuels: natural gas, electricity, propane, and heating oil. And I wanted to give you the bottom line up front, and that is that we expect the majority of households will spend about the same on energy this winter as they did last winter. Overall, we expect that there's going to be, generally speaking, lower fuel prices that are going to be offset by higher consumption this winter. In this plot, what you're seeing is the percent change in forecast expenditures this winter relative to last winter. And you'll see that there are 3 data points per fuel. The circles represent our base forecast, and the diamonds represent our colder and warmer cases, because temperature can have a significant impact on expenditures. And we'll talk about this in more detail later in the presentation. With regard to our base case, which again are those circles, households using natural gas and electricity will have slightly higher expenditures this winter compared with last. Propane will be about the same, and heating oil bills will be a bit lower than last winter. Taking into account the temperature cases, you can see that there's a wider spread in potential expenditures for propane and heating oil, and that just has to do with how those markets function. It's because wholesale prices are more rapidly passed to retail customers that use those fuels. I also just want to note that we're averaging over several factors here that could affect expenditures for a particular home, right? So for example, there's significant regional variation in our forecast expenditures, and I'll talk about that again in more detail later in the presentation. There's really a lot to unpack from this one high-level result, so let's dig in. Next slide. There are 3 main factors that determine spending on space heating fuel. First is household characteristics, which affect consumption levels. Then we have weather, which can affect both consumption and prices. And then finally, we have the energy prices themselves, which are determined by market conditions. And we estimate household expenditures by taking the product of consumption and price. So in the following slides, I want to give a broad overview of those determinants for this winter, and then we'll follow it up with a more specific discussion for each of the four main heating fuels. And we're going to start with these household characteristics. So next slide. 96% of homes in the United States are primarily heated with one of the four fuels that we cover in this outlook. The heating fuel that gets used in a house is a major determinant of the expenditures, and heating fuels are not used uniformly across the country as indicated on the map here. You can see the legend on the left. The idea here is that the darker colors indicate a higher share of homes using a particular fuel. The bar on the very bottom shows national shares of primary heating fuels by fuel type. So just to go through them quickly, natural gas is the most widely used heating fuel, and it's used by 45% of US homes, again, as the primary heating fuel. Electricity is the second most common. It's predominant across the South, and it's used by 43% of households. Propane is used mostly in northern states and represents 5% of households. And finally, heating oil is really concentrated in the northeastern states and represents 3% of US households. Next slide. Now, we report forecasted expenditures by census region, not at the state level. So this figure just shows the aggregation up to the regional level. So the donuts represent the regional share of households using a given primary heating fuel. And the number inside the donut, that just represents the total number of households in millions within that census region. And what you can see from the graphs is that electricity and natural gas are really prevalent across the entire country. Again, propane is predominantly used in the Midwest and heating oil in the Northeast, but you can see that even in those regions, they don't represent the majority share. The other thing I want to point out is that we don't forecast values for homes that heat with wood or other less common fuels. Next slide. I also wanted to provide some context on our estimates. So we forecast, again, the average expenditures for households using a given primary heating fuel over the winter season. But if we take a step back, here we're showing total annual household expenditures using historical data. The expenditure data that you see on this slide is taken from our residential energy consumption survey, which was last conducted in 2020. And the information that is taken from that survey is the foundation for our forecasted household consumption. So let me explain what's going on inside each box. So each fuel is presented as a square, and that those squares are divided into three sections. We have a left-right split that shows how expenditures are divided between the main heating fuel and all other fuels. And then within that left colored portion, you see that there's a top-bottom split that shows space heating on the top and other end uses on the bottom. So what we're doing in the winter fuels outlook is we're focused on those colored bars on the left, but we're only looking at those expenditures over the winter season, okay? One thing I want to point out as you look across the four fuels, you notice that homes using electricity as their primary source of heat stand out from the rest. So space heating, for those homes, space heating is only a small portion of their total annual expenditures. You can see a big portion of the light blue box is actually air conditioning, which is an other end use. And air conditioning would be accounted for in the gray boxes associated with the other three fuels. So one of the takeaway points from this slide is for that homes that use electricity as their primary source of heat, they really make little use of other fuels. They're essentially using electricity to meet most of their end use demands. Next slide. I also want to talk a little bit about weather sensitivities, and to address the uncertainty we have in this winter's weather, we look at different weather cases. Next slide. So weather affects expenditures in two ways. First, at the individual household level, colder temperatures are going to increase demand, right? That increase in demand leads to higher expenditures. But also, if we look across all the homes that have a little bit higher demand in colder weather, that aggregate consumption can also affect prices, and those prices in turn can be passed on to residential customers. Next slide. So again, because of that, temperatures are a key source of uncertainty in our forecasts. This plot is showing heating degree days, which are a temperature-based measure that's correlated with demand. And so when you see higher numbers imply higher demand associated with colder temperatures. So this figure is showing forecasted and actual heating degree days over the last decade. Those gray dots represent the beginning of the season forecast, and it's a light blue dot for this upcoming winter. The blue diamonds represent actual heating degree days that were realized for those past winters. And then the bars represent our alternative weather forecasts. And what we do is we take our base case heating degree days, and then we increase and decrease the heating degree days by 10%. That's how those bars are formed. And you can see that those plus minus 10% variations capture the difference between predicted and observed pretty well over the last decade. So looking ahead to this winter, our forecast has 5% more heating degree days than last winter, so that implies it's going to be a little bit colder. This winter, though, is expected to be a little bit warmer with 2% fewer heating degree days when we look at the 10-year average. Okay, so that gives some context on what we expect for weather. Next slide. Again, remember that expenditures are the product of the fuel price and consumption levels. We've talked about household characteristics and weather and how they can affect consumption. Now I want to talk about market prices. So next slide. So in this slide, we're showing the link between wholesale and retail prices. For all four fuels, we're showing retail prices on the top because they're generally higher, and wholesale prices are on the bottom. And I want to step through each of these one by one. So first, with natural gas on the left here, there's slow pass-through from wholesale to retail markets, and that's largely due to the nature of gas utility regulation. But impacts can vary by state and even by utility within a state. Overall, what this means is that on the bottom with the Henry Hub price, you can see that there's short-term volatility in wholesale markets, but it gets smoothed out into a regular seasonal pattern in the retail market. Over longer periods, changes in natural gas wholesale and retail prices are closely correlated. This winter, natural gas prices for residential consumers are expected to be down 4% from last winter. Okay, moving over to electricity. The pass-through dynamics for electricity are very similar to natural gas because prices are regulated by utility commissions. Again, looking ahead to this winter, electricity prices for residential consumers are expected to be the same as last winter. Then moving on to heating oil and propane, price changes in wholesale markets for those two fuels are passed to consumers quickly because the rates in those markets are not regulated in the same way. We generally see changes in the wholesale prices become fully reflected in retail prices over a period of about 4 to 6 weeks. Although we're expecting consumers to pay less for these fuels this winter, prices for these fuels are tied to global markets, particularly for heating oil, and those prices can change over the course of the winter. Specifically for propane, we forecast that residential propane prices will be about 5% lower on average across the country this winter. And for heating oil, we forecast residential heating oil prices will be 9% lower this winter. Next slide. So let's see how consumption and prices come together into expenditures. Before I show you those expenditure estimates, though, it's really important, again, to keep in mind that we're providing estimates that average across many different factors, including different households with different characteristics in different locations that experience different weather, even within the same region, right? And this is particularly important to keep in mind when we display estimates for different fuels on the same slide. Again, expenditures can vary significantly based on the specific characteristics of an individual home. So if you wanted to estimate expenditures for a particular home, you would want to take into account all of the detailed characteristics associated with that house. So again, the results here, they don't imply, the other point here is that the results we present, they don't imply cost savings by switching from one fuel to another with lower expenditures. It really depends on the details. And the values we present here are averages that are meant to be indicative. Next slide. Sorry, next slide. So here's one of our key results, and this shows what we're showing here is the base case month-by-month expenditures for each fuel type. You can see that it's a stacked bar graph, so space heating and other end uses are broken out. The space heating portion is represented by the darker bars on top that have the value labels, and then other end uses are on the bottom. And you can see when you look across the other end uses in that lighter color, we're seeing essentially flat consumption. The other end uses only vary based on the number of days in the month, and then just some slight month-to-month changes in retail prices, okay? Again, electricity stands out. Monthly electricity bills include much higher other end uses compared to the other three fuels, and that just reflects how many household demands are met with electricity in the winter months, like lighting, appliances, and water heating. So when you go to pay your electricity bill, you're not just paying for the space heating component in the dark blue, you're paying the electricity bill for the whole house, which includes all these other end uses. The other point I want to emphasize is that we don't distinguish between different equipment types. So for example, with electricity, we're not distinguishing between heat pumps and electric resistance heating. There's a longer explanation in the report about the statistical challenges of trying to do so at the equipment level. But again, for our purposes here, these values are meant to be indicative. Next slide. Here's exactly the same result, except we've added gray bars to the top of the stack, and that's to indicate the increased expenditures under the colder case, right? Remember, colder temperatures are going to increase consumption, which will increase expenditures. Those colder temperatures add about $6 to $10 to the monthly bills for natural gas and electricity, and they add about $15 to $40 for propane and heating oil. And then although we don't show it here, under the warmer case, again, consumption gets reduced, so expenditures fall below the base case. Next slide. So again, we're back to the key result that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. As a reminder, this is showing the percent change in total winter expenditures from last winter to this winter. Again, as I noted, the outlook is mixed, though we expect most households will spend similar amounts to last winter. Again, I want to emphasize that temperature cases, different temperatures can produce a wider range in propane and heating oil bills. And that's, again, due to the rapid pass-through from wholesale to retail markets that we talked about. Again, also remember the caveats. We're averaging over many variables that matter at the individual household level. Okay, and with that, next slide, we're going to get a more in-depth view at the regional level, and I want to start with natural gas. And again, as a reminder, natural gas is the most widely used space heating fuel in the U.S. Next slide. So for each of the four fuels, I'm going to show you a slide with the same format, so I just want to take a second to walk you through it. U.S. average month-by-month expenditures are on the left, and the four census regions are on the right. The circle in the upper left of each figure shows the base case expenditure for this winter, and the percent represents the change from last winter, okay? The dotted line represents last winter, and the three solid colored lines represent the base and warmer, colder temperature cases. The lines for the three cases represent, again, the total monthly natural gas bill for a home that primarily heats with natural gas. You also notice that there's a gray line a little bit lower down, and that shows the other end uses portion of the bill. Okay, so essentially up to that gray line is other end uses. And then if you wanted to know the portion of the monthly natural gas bill attributable to space heating, it would be the difference between those colored lines and the gray line at the bottom. That's the heating portion of the bill. So the key takeaways are nationally, we expect households to spend about $600 on natural gas this winter, which is roughly the same as last winter. About 80% of that is attributable to space heating in the base case, and that goes up to about 85% in the colder temperature case. The West and South show expenditures falling a bit from last year, and the main outlier is in the Midwest, where we expect natural gas bills will be up about 11% this winter. Last winter was really mild in the Midwest, which contributed to those low expenditures. This winter represents more of a return to normal by historical standards, and that's going to increase demand and then therefore expenditures relative to last winter. Okay, next slide. Now let's look at inventory levels, and inventories are an important factor in price formation. Higher inventory levels generally correlate with lower prices and vice versa. Here we're looking at natural gas inventory levels across all 4 natural gas storage regions, which are different from the census regions I showed earlier. The gray line represents the 5-year average, which is a common benchmark for comparison, and that dark red line you see for each region indicates inventory levels over recent history. First thing you notice is probably a clear seasonal pattern in inventory levels. Inventories typically build from April through the end of October to early November to provide adequate supply for the winter. Overall, we expect the trend of flat production and rising exports will bring U.S. natural gas inventories down to the 5-year average by the end of this winter. So for example, if you look at the South Central region, inventory levels are now at the 5-year average following surplus conditions over most of the past year. And then in the Pacific and Mountain region, all the way to the left, they still have surplus inventory, but it's expected to drop to the 5-year average early next year. These inventory drops will place upward pressure on natural gas prices through the winter and into 2025. Next slide. Okay, next I want to go over propane. Again, it's mostly concentrated in the Midwest and Northeast, and propane consumption in the Midwest is one of our highest concerns because cold weather increases demand, which can have a market effect on prices. Next slide. Forecast U.S. average expenditure is about $1,190 for this winter, which again is about the same as last year. Across all of the regions, we expect propane prices will be lower than last winter, but those lower prices are offset by higher consumption compared with last winter. Notice the significant increase in the Midwest cold scenario. So that's the top center graph. And I'm looking at the brown line on top. You can see its expenditures go a lot higher in the cold temperature case. Prices in the Midwest can spike in the case of very cold weather with long supply chains that are required to bring supplies into the region, often by truck or rail. So that's something we pay careful attention to. Next slide. For that reason, propane inventory levels matter a lot. Here we're looking at pads, which again are different than the census regions. Nearly all excess to the 5-year average is in the Gulf Coast region, and the inventories that sit in the Gulf Coast region are not cheaply or quickly available to the major propane consumption centers in the Midwest. Once those barrels move south, it's hard to move them back north. So Midwest stocks are also above average, albeit not quite as high as in the Gulf Coast. If weather's normal or even a little bit colder than we expect, it shouldn't pose a problem for the Midwest. But in the case of a severe and prolonged cold snap in the Midwest, and there's a need to pull inventories from the Gulf Coast, that will likely cause propane prices to rise. Next slide. Okay, on to heating oil. Again, the vast majority, about 82% of the homes using heating oil are concentrated in the northeastern U.S. Next slide. This one's a little bit simpler. We only provide a U.S. average for heating oil, but because most of the consumption is in the Northeast, this is also effectively a forecast for the Northeast. Baseline heating oil expenditures are forecast to fall 5% this winter. Lower than expected prices more than compensate, though, for colder expected temperatures. Forecast heating oil prices are down a bit this year due to lower refining margins, and we're going to take a more careful look at that in a second. Heating oil prices, keep in mind, are also dependent on crude oil prices, which are of course uncertain. The recent escalation in the Middle East conflict has caused crude oil prices to rise over the past week or so, and prices could move higher if there's some kind of a disruption to crude oil flows or production doesn't quite materialize in the way that we expect. Next slide. So let's take a more careful look at those refining margins, which I mentioned have declined this winter. Refining margins are indicative of refiner profit margins, and it's calculated by subtracting the crude oil price from the wholesale price of a refined product. And remember, heating oil is part of a larger distillate fuel category, and the predominant distillate fuel is diesel, which is mainly used in the transportation sector. Refiner margins had been very high since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but over the last year, they've returned closer to historical levels because of weak diesel demand globally, and we've had some refinery capacity expansions. We expect both crude oil prices and refining margins for distillate fuel to be lower this winter compared with last winter. And looking at the figure on the left, you can see this close correlation between the retail price of heating oil and the price of Brent crude. And then on the right, you see the stacked bars that show retail heating oil prices and the three different components. And you can see the refining margins in red, how they've dropped from last winter to this winter. Next slide. And then with regard to inventory levels, distillate inventories remain low in both the Gulf Coast and East Coast pads. They've been consistently below the 5-year average, especially on the East Coast. And just a couple observations about that. In the recent past, we've had some East Coast refinery closures that have left distillate inventories low. But we've also had lower demand for distillate on the East Coast, and that's reduced inventory needs beyond what we would have expected otherwise. Next slide. And then finally, last but not least, electricity. Again, electricity is widely used across the United States, particularly in the southern US. Next slide. On average, electricity expenditures are up slightly compared to last year. The South is an exception where expenditures are forecast to be down slightly. And again, a few notes on electricity here. Remember the high level of other end uses. So it's probably easiest to look at the national graph on the left. You see that gray line is up higher than it is for the other fuels. And that's because of all the other end uses that are being met with electricity. So if you want to know the heating portion associated with electricity, it's the difference between those three blue lines and the gray line lower down. Remember, we're averaging over equipment types and other household characteristics. You know, if you have a brand new heat pump, all else equal, it's going to be more efficient than electric resistance heating, but we're not capturing those differences in equipment here. Again, the values are meant to be indicative of homes that heat with electricity. If you're trying to estimate expenditures for a particular home, then those equipment details and household characteristics would matter a lot. Next slide. That's the high-level overview of our winter fuels outlook. I just want to leave you with a few EIA resources. Next slide. So we track these markets very carefully. We plan to provide monthly updates in our short-term energy outlook through April 2025, so you can look for updates. And then here we have a set of hyperlinks to various products and data sources that we use to track these markets. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt, who is planning to moderate our discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Joe. At this time, I'd like to invite our panelists to please turn your cameras on. And a reminder, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in the Teams control panel. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists. First is Owen Comstock. He's our Winter Fuels Outlook lead. Tim Hess, our Short-Term Energy Outlook lead. Corrina Ricker, our Natural Gas Analyst. Josh Eiermann, our Propane Analyst. Kevin Hack, our Heating Oil Analyst. And Tyler Hodge, our Electricity Analyst. Thank you all very much for being here. First question, Corrina, directed for you. What might happen to natural gas prices if there is a major winter storm?
Thanks for the question, Matt. So something like a major winter storm or an acute weather event is difficult to build into our forecast because the impact on price of something like that would be highly dependent on where the storm hits. For example, if it were to impact production or if it's close to large demand centers, those types of factors would really play into how the natural gas price would be impacted. If a storm were to impact prices, the impact would be most quickly felt in the wholesale price because of some of what Joe was mentioning with how natural gas retail prices are regulated. The impact to the wholesale price would be passed along to retail prices that consumers would pay with a lag because of how states regulate natural gas prices, which adds another layer of complexity here because those regulations can vary by state. Typically, the price impacts to wholesale natural gas prices from acute weather events are short-lived as the storm passes and production comes back online and the demand spike dissipates. And the last thing that I'll say here is that there are examples of these types of storms impacting natural gas prices over the past several years that we dig deeper into with some articles that we write in Today in Energy, for example, or in the Natural Gas Weekly Update, which is a venue where we dive deeper into region-specific supply and demand dynamics and price impacts over the winter. So if you're interested in how these storms have affected natural gas prices in specific examples of that over the past, I would encourage you to look into some of that analysis.
Great. Thank you very much, Corrina. And Kevin, a question directed to you. Does EIA think that overall diesel consumption could pick up over the course of the winter, and could that contribute to higher heating oil prices?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so our expectation for overall diesel consumption kind of going into next year is to see it kind of rising gradually in early 2025. So that would, and that's built into the base case. So, if there's additional kind of higher global diesel demand beyond that, then that would contribute to, ultimately higher diesel crack spreads and therefore higher diesel prices. But like I said, we've got some built into the base case, and there's even some uncertainty there about, that consumption could also kind of be weaker depending on your outlook. So given that, I think generally, ultimately the heating oil price remains highly dependent on what happens with the kind of global diesel market. Heating oil is a pretty small share of kind of total global diesel consumption. And at this point, the two are relatively comparable fuels. So really the heating oil price kind of falls out of whatever's going on with global diesel markets.
Great, thank you. Question for Tyler regarding electricity. Why is EIA forecasting electricity retail rates to increase if wholesale prices are going down?
Yes, that's actually a good question. With retail electricity rates, what we report here at EIA in our Winter Fuels Outlook, there can be a little bit of a disconnect between what retail customers see and what's actually going on in wholesale power markets. So it's definitely true that wholesale prices have come down quite a bit over the last year or so. But that was actually compared to really high prices that were occurring back in 2021 and 2022. So the rates that people pay on their electricity bills obviously have to account for the cost of producing electricity. So many customers in many parts of the country actually are still subject to retail rate regulation, where the prices that they receive have to be approved by regulatory customers. So there can be a bit of a lag between when changes in retail rates occur compared to when the changes in actual costs occurred. So given that the wholesale prices have been coming down over the last year or so, what we're really starting to see now is the effect of those retail prices sort of moderating. And that's why for this winter, we don't expect a huge amount of change in retail rates, the prices won't likely fall because there's still other components of retail electricity bills that need to be accounted for, specifically transmission and distribution. And those costs are still remain relatively elevated. So that's why we're expecting just a slight increase in retail rates this winter.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Tyler. A question came in about propane for Josh. What can we expect for propane imports and exports this winter?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Exports are usually on people's mind in the propane market during the winter, just because that can draw down on inventories that we saw Joe presenting in Pad 3, because most propane is exported from the Gulf Coast. For those unfamiliar, propane is not just only used as a space heating fuel, it's also used as a petrochemical feedstock to produce propylene, which is then used to produce derivatives of polypropylene, such as hard plastics and your car interiors and stuff like that. During the winter, we saw propane exports get really high last winter. However, because of higher production and higher inventories, that didn't affect inventories too much. This winter, we're expecting propane exports to be to kind of cool off a bit from where they've been this summer, mostly because PDH units are propane dehydrogenation units in China, which consume propane to create propylene. Those units have been running very low, mostly because there's been this glut of propylene coming out of Asia, so prices are very low for propylene, and thus we're expecting slightly less demand for propane exports coming out of the Gulf Coast. And then looking at propane imports, we usually get a good supply of propane imports from Canada. These are usually railed down from the Edmonton region. However, there's two newer propane export terminals on the west coast of Canada. So, and there's also a petrochemical complex in Canada that is also fairly recent, since 2022, that's consuming their own propane. So Canada's been consuming more of their own propane rather than railing it down to the U.S. Midwest. However, the U.S. has been getting supplied by water from West Africa. So there's some maritime propane imports that we get, and those usually go into the New England area at the two propane import terminals. So we can expect a few shipments coming in, usually from West or Northern Africa, going into the New England market.
Great, thank you, Josh. And Owen, a question for you. Are there any state level forecasts that our audience members can find?
Yes, we don't have state level forecasts, but EIA does have state level information that I think can inform some of the questions about state level detail. First, I would point to the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, which is, as Joe talked about, is a key component of how we arrive at these forecasts. The Residential Energy Consumption Survey, or RECS as we call it, does have state level data for 2020, which was the year that was last conducted. And so if you can use that to kind of look at the variation within regions, because these census regions are pretty large. But that can provide some information about how a certain state might compare to a regional average. And then I think the other thing I would point to for state level detail throughout the winter, especially for propane and heating oil markets, we have the heating oil and propane update that's going to have heating oil and propane prices throughout weekly values throughout the winter. And starting in November, we're going to have some detailed information about inventories that's a little bit more detailed than what we can provide in some of our other weekly surveys. So those are some resources, and again, that's all linked at the bottom of the Winter Fuels Outlook and within this presentation, so that people can look for that state level data and values throughout the winter.
Right. Thank you very much, Owen. Those are the end of the questions that we received. I would like to thank we just had one come in. Corrina, this would be for you about natural gas. Can you comment on the natural gas use for power generation with respect to increase in power cost for consumers this year?
I might actually ask Tyler to help me out with this one because of the increase in power costs for consumers this year. I think it might be able to help me out with this one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you repeat that question?
Yep. Can you comment
it
on?
Has a little bit to do with both.
It does, yeah. It crosses too. Comment on natural gas use for power generation with respect to the increase in the cost for consumers this year.
Okay. Yeah. So I think what the question is getting at is like the upward trend we're seeing in natural gas generation, where natural gas is like the primary source of power generation now. So yes, it is true that natural gas is like the marginal fuel, the most expensive fuel that's dispatched generally for power generation. So wholesale power prices in particular will be kind of a function of changes in natural gas prices. So as I mentioned earlier, the wholesale prices, the power prices came down quite a bit over the last year or two, and that was mainly due to a dramatic decline in natural gas fuel costs. I think in 2022, gas prices came down or in 2023 last year, gas prices are down like half of what they were in 2022. So those are the types of costs that are sort of moderating any further increases that we're seeing in consumer retail prices.
Great. Thank you very much.
And
all right.
Can I add something to that real quick?
Yes, please.
Just that, I think part of what we're seeing is, in our forecast, we're showing natural gas use for power generation, like in the first quarter of 2025, actually down a little bit from last year. And that has, that has a lot to do with the gas price, right? That we're showing, Henry Hub prices, we're looking at about $1 higher on average. Again, last winter was pretty low. So, because of the mild weather, but, you're seeing that the slightly higher than last year, although not particularly high by historical standards, natural gas price kind of, put a little bit of dent into demand from the power sector there.
No, that's a good point. That there's also a lot of new solar projects coming online, and that might contribute to some of the reduction we might see in natural gas generation next year.
All right, great. Thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I hope that you found this year's Winter Fuels Outlook informative. I'd like to thank Administrator Joe DeCarolis for the presentation. Thank you to Owen Comstock, our WFO lead, and to all of our panelists here today, and to everyone at EIA that contributed to our Winter Fuels Outlook. And with that, our webinar is concluding, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.